So today I am talking to David Hutchings. He's a physics teacher based in York. Hi, David.
Hi.
And David has just co-authored his first book, which is called Let There Be Science, with Tom McLeish, who's a physics professor from Durham, and he's someone who we've featured on Science and Belief in the past. So we're really glad you're here, David. And we're going to be talking about questions, but first I gather you want to tell us about a levitating frog.
Yeah, it's one of the stories from the book. It is an odd one, and it's quite a funny one. It goes back to Andre Guy, physics professor at Manchester University and Nobel Prize winner in 2010. But in the year 2000, he won an Ig Nobel Prize. They are prizes for amusing or slightly bonkers physics. So he's the only person ever to have won both, and I think he's probably slightly prouder of the first one, given the type of character he is. But it's because he had spotted adverts in magazines and newspapers and online that there were these little magnets that you could attach to your taps in your kitchen or bathroom, and then you wouldn't get limescale.
Okay.
And like all good scientists, he was pretty sceptical. But then his scepticism didn't just stop there. He decided to investigate it a bit further. And one of the things he found was we didn't really know that much about the relationship between magnetism and water. So I don't know what you think, Ruth, but people would do different things in that situation. Maybe they would go and read up a few papers, perhaps try out a few slight tweaks to the experiments that they'd found already. But Andre Geim took a very different approach. He happens to be in the neighbourhood of a very, very powerful electromagnet. And in his own words, he says, I poured water inside the lab's electromagnet when it was at maximum power. Pouring water in one's equipment is certainly not a standard scientific approach. I cannot recall why I behaved so unprofessionally. Apparently no one had tried such a silly thing before, although similar facilities existed in several places around the world for decades. So the reason I like the introduction to this story is that you would think the answer to the question, is water magnetic, would be one that we would have known for quite a long time. And he's making the point that actually nobody really had any idea. And his solution to that was, well, why don't I just try it? So then what ended up happening was, and again this is his own words, as a result we saw balls of levitating water. So this water actually stopped in the middle of the electromagnet and just hovered there. And when he tried to tell people, a lot of people didn't believe him. He says that many colleagues, including those who'd worked with high magnetic fields all their life, were flabbergasted, and some of them even argued it was a hoax. It was then that he did a bit more digging and found that actually this had been discovered twice in the past and then forgotten.
Right.
So he decided that he needed to draw more attention to it, and perhaps that would be by going more public. So he started to find other things that he could float in this magnetic field, and eventually ended up doing with a live frog, which, as you might expect, made it onto news programs around the world. And won him the Ig Nobel Prize. The frog was not harmed, just in case anyone's having a bit of a panic.
That's very cool. That is very cool. And you had another story about someone who solved a problem with a really ingenious solution.
Yeah, in the same way that this Andre Geim solved the problem by asking a question that it kind of seemed like people should have asked before. Why don't you try it? There was another case, but to do with proteins. So you get these things called amino acids. They're quite small, they're just collections of a few atoms, but if you start sticking them together into long chains, you end up with these giant molecules or chemicals called proteins. But I'm told, the biologists tell me, are very important. They're not fundamentals, that's why we don't study them in physics, but I'm told they're very important. Is that right?
Yes, very important.
Okay. And once you've got this long string and you can find out, what atoms and molecules are in it, that's only half the story. If you want to know what it does and its function in a living organism or anything like that, then you have to know that they fold up into these incredibly intricate patterns. Is that about right?
Yeah.
So this was an issue that a guy called David Baker, a biochemist at the University of Washington, was working on. But it's notoriously difficult. You can figure out what the protein's made of, but actually figuring out what shape it will fold into is incredibly difficult, because it can fold in millions and millions of different ways. So you can't, working through them systematically is a massive task. And it sounds like exactly the kind of job for a computer, but this is just one of those jobs that computers find very, very difficult to do. There are some things that human beings are pretty good at that computers struggle at, and a lot of that can be to do with image manipulation, which is why you have those little icons on some web pages when you're trying to log in, and it says, can you write down the letters you can see in the box? Because a computer can't do that. A human can do it very easily, but a computer can't do it. And this protein problem turned out to be similar, that David Baker had written this computer program that he hoped would just rifle through all of these different arrangements and pick out the best one. But a lot of the time, he didn't do that. He didn't pick the best one out. And that's when you get this brilliant question from him that unlocks a whole new field, where he says, well, what would happen if we turned it into a computer game?
So you make protein folding, which is, I think, quite boring. I'm not a biochemist. Into a computer game. That's genius.
Yeah, so he got in touch with his computer science friends in the same University of Washington, and they actually did make a game called Fold It, where they put a whole bunch of proteins in this game, and you folded them, and you scored points for how well you folded them based on some kind of known physics and chemical processes. And then they released it for free out online, and you had teenagers playing these protein folding games, and it was pretty astonishing, the outcome. I mean, they didn't know whether it would go anywhere, but the results were far beyond they could ever have imagined. In one case, they were looking at the structure of an AIDS-related virus, and it had been an unresolved problem for 15 years that no one could figure out quite how to fold the protein that was involved. And the Fold It gamers solved it in 10 days.
Nice.
So it's that question of, can you turn it into a game, accelerates the process more than you could ever have guessed. And you've got teenagers doing science that, the pros in the labs were struggling to get done.
So, I mean, in a sense, is this science at its most intuitive?
Well, I think it's hard to get away from the idea when you hear stories like that science kind of sits in our gut somewhere. We just are scientific. And some people might say, oh, I'm not scientific, I can't do the equations, but I think if you find the right interface, the right way of getting someone to interact with science, it kind of sits there. It's a human thing. It's inside all of us, this ability to see the world in different ways and play around with what's in front of us and come up with the most amazing descriptions and understandings and solutions. So yeah, I think science is hardwired into us as people. It's a really, really nice illustration of that.
Yeah, and this is people with no professional training who are actually feeding into science.
Yeah, these are people who wouldn't even necessarily know what a protein is.
That's quite astonishing.
In fact, they may know even less about proteins than I showed that I knew about them.
I think you're doing yourself down. I think you know a fair bit. But and this is also about people who ask questions no one thought of asking before.
Yeah, there seems to be a pattern throughout the history of science that what makes more difference to scientific progress is a really good question. It turns up again and again and again. An answer sort of completes a process, but a question starts a new one. And often it's these new ideas, these questions that unlock the next room, and then Okay, people do a bit of legwork finding what's in the room, but it's the great questions that change the game.
Yeah.
Einstein says, as far as he's concerned, that the big difference between him and a lot of his colleagues who didn't make the same progress was his own questioning. He said that he never stopped asking questions, and that's what drove his science.
Mm-hmm. And this is, you've been writing, you and Tom are both Christians, so
that's right.
Can you talk a bit about what faith has to do with that? Because there is this point of view that our faith is about just believing, and you almost turn the questions off, because if you ask too many, it will fall apart.
Yeah, that's exactly what A.N. Wilson said. He's not a scientist. He's a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, and he wrote a book called Jesus in 1992, where his argument was, look, this is clearly just a guy. He's not God. There's a lot of mythology around him. We don't know that much about him. And one of the accusations that he makes about Christianity and about Christians, he says, when Christians start thinking about Jesus, things start breaking down and they lose their faith. It's perfectly possible to go to church every Sunday and not ask any questions, but they fear that if they do ask questions, they'll lose their Christ. And of course, you have other people on record as well, Dawkins, saying faith delights in not asking questions, it's seen as a virtue. And to be fair to them, I think you will find Christians who do think like that. It's not, they are not just setting up straw men. I think there can be a culture sometimes that don't ask questions, but I think what's important when we're asking about Christianity is to say, okay, well, what about biblical, historical Christianity? What about the teaching in the Bible? That's really what we're talking about. And if you can find examples of bad practice out there, because we're all less than perfect, well, that's not how we should define Christianity. We should define it based on who Jesus is and what he taught and what the Bible says.
Yeah. So what did you find when you were looking through with this question in mind?
It's been quite, even as someone who already thought, look, the Bible encourages questioning, doing the sort of extra bit of research for the book showed me there was even more questioning in the Bible than I had thought there was. So there are 1,200 chapters in the Bible, and some of your listeners will know that most of these chapters are quite short. They might be 400 words, something like that. But in those 1,200 chapters, there are 3,300 questions.
That's quite a lot of questions.
And what is particularly interesting about them is that a lot of them are questions that are asked by God.
Right.
And asked by Jesus. And then you have to start thinking, okay, why are those questions there? They cannot be there because God needs information. They can't be there because God is saying, I don't know the answer and I'm asking the question to find out, because the Bible consistently presents God as all-knowing. So if he already knows everything, why is he asking questions? And you can say the same with Jesus. Jesus on the earth, and Christians believe he's God. The Bible, the New Testament presents him as God. Why is he asking questions if he knows everything?
Yeah.
And I think one of the key breakthroughs there is to understand that that questioning is there to encourage us to think about the answers and ask those questions for ourselves. The very first question in the Bible is a question that God asks Adam and Eve. They have gone against what he instructed them. They suddenly feel all this guilt and shame, and they hide because they realise things have gone dramatically wrong. And then God says, where are you? And again, just to make the point, he's not asking because he doesn't know where they are.
Yeah.
So why is he asking, where are you? Well, the only sensible way to understand that is he's getting them to think about it themselves.
Right.
Adam and Eve, I'm saying, where are you? But I know where you are. Adam and Eve, then probably maybe to think about their own situation. Where are they? Why are they hiding? What's gone on? You know, do they need to rethink the situation? And I think if you start to look at questions in the Bible like that those questions are then designed to make you ask the question yourself, it really puts a new spin on a lot of the questions that Jesus asks.
Right.
Like, he says, why are you so afraid?
Yeah.
Why do you entertain evil thoughts in your heart? Why did you doubt?
Yeah.
And of course, the most important one of all that Jesus asks, who do you say I am? So, Christianity has got this questioning riddled all the way through it.
Yep.
So yeah, and it's not just God asking questions. There are long passages where people ask questions of God. And again, if the teaching in Christianity was no, don't ask questions, you just believe, then we would expect to see any dialogue where someone asks a question for him to just, smite them out.
Slap them down, yeah.
Yeah, and say your job is not to ask questions.
Dare you, yeah.
But we don't see that. We see that when people ask God questions in both the Old and the New Testament, he then interacts with them. He will either answer them or he'll ask another question back, but there is interaction there. And that is how you encourage questioning. You don't just shut it down.
Yeah.
You continue the conversation.
And you would know that as a teacher. And so this book, the book especially focuses on the biblical book of Job. And so I wanted to know, having looked at that book through this lens, do you think Job would have been a good scientist?
So the reason that we talk about the book of Job, or one of them, is that it places this huge amount of value on wisdom. In chapter 28, there's what's known as the hymn to wisdom that says, seek wisdom is more precious than rubies. It's something that you should treasure more than anything else. It's invitational. And then you also have, at the end of Job, this response from God to the questions that Job has been asking all the way through the book. He's in this dreadful situation and he doesn't know what's going on, and he asks questions of God, and in response, at the end, you get this dramatic storm turning up and God speaking out of the storm with a string of questions. And I think the most common reading of it, generally speaking, is that is just a huge put down, that God is saying to Job, look, here's all this stuff you don't know, and therefore shut up. But that doesn't fit with this pattern that we've talked about through the rest of the Bible, where questioning is encouraged. So I think the truth is slightly different to that. That there certainly is an element of God reminding Job that he is a creature with a very limited amount of knowledge. And if you only see it as that, if you only see it as God saying, you don't know anything, stay quiet, then you would be very much seeing that answer in isolation and not part of a bigger picture about the Bible. So if you let the rest of the Bible direct you towards how to interpret that, then I would say, yes, there's still the element of God putting Job in his place, but I think also you say, well, what a way to put him in his place, to say, hey, look, if you want to know more about divine justice, if you want to know more about me, you will actually find some of these answers in nature, because nearly all of these questions are nature questions. And just so that people don't feel that has been plucked out of thin air as an interpretation to use to sell a book, it's quite similar to what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, where he says, what can be known about God has been made clear in nature.
So what you're saying is we don't know whether Job would have been a very good scientist, but God is, in a sense, encouraging to ask more questions, which is always a good thing.
Yeah, and also you've got to look at when Job lived. I mean, some of those questions are most of those questions are questions that Job could not have found the final answer to.
No.
In the same way that Newton himself said, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, that science is something that progresses. But I definitely think that you can see in those questions in Job a sort of an invitation to be asking those questions as humanity. Yeah. We believe that the Bible, Christians believe that the Bible speaks to all generations. And it's become this hugely important philosophical text. It's one of the oldest in the Bible. And the fact is that some of those questions in there, we now know the answers to. Well, that's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, that is amazing. So can you sum up the message of the book as a whole? Is it, from my looking at it, it seemed to be that, here's this vital part Christianity has played in science, and looking at a biblical Christianity, this is something we should be doing. Is that a fair summary of the book, or would you put it another way?
Yeah, I think that is definitely one of the major threads running through the book. But I would say that overall, what we're trying to draw attention to is that the core principles in Christianity will produce good science. So, for example, Christians have been encouraged by the Bible to ask questions.
Right.
Well, is that good for science? Yeah, we see that's great in science. Einstein and Geim and this folded computer game. But that's just one example. Other examples would be the notion that actually, in the first place, we have been made with a mind that is in some ways similar to God's. We've been made in the image of God. So there is a mind, God's mind conceives the universe and brought it into being, and he's made us a bit like him. So therefore, if the mind, the grand mind that made the whole universe, is then replicated in us to a certain extent, then there's that capability for us to understand the universe. There's like a resonance between those minds where the same sort of patterns that God put into place make sense to us. And we look at examples in the book again and again and again where people have intuitively found answers to very deep mathematical realities about our universe or scientific realities about our universe. And sometimes they've been doing it when they've been playing around. They haven't even been trying to find those answers. So each chapter says, look, here is a core principle of the Christian faith and an important calling on the Christian. And then we ask the question, would that produce good science or bad science?
Right.
And every time the answer is, hey, it produces good science, which helps us, I think, understand why it is that wherever you can find a Christian culture, you do see science flourishing. Throughout history, pretty much. That nowadays, the sad thing is I have students, I start teaching them when they're 14, and by that point, they think you have to pick a side, God or science. But I would say to them, no, look, this concept of modern science that we're now doing was birthed, or at least reached some sort of maturity within a Christian context. Christians doing it. The idea that it's an enlightenment, a bunch of atheists in the Enlightenment threw off the shackles of religion and developed great science is a myth. And that actually most of the people involved in this dramatic change in the 1600s were Christians saying they were doing their science for Christian reasons.
Yeah. So that is a very positive relationship between science and faith that you're mapping out there. And it sounds like the book will be incredibly helpful to people who are scientists as well as people who are not. So, and that's available from Lion right now. And we will put the link up on the Science and Belief website where people can get hold of it. So thank you very much, Dave, for talking to me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Great. And we'll, all the very best with that, and look forward to some more books in the future.